Okay, let's dive right in. We are going to be unpacking one of the most, I think, frustrating and fundamental challenges of just being human, really. How do you actually change someone's mind or their behavior or even their most deeply held beliefs?
It is the universal paradox, isn't it? I mean, we spend so much mental energy, so much time trying to persuade people.
Oh, yeah.
And it doesn't matter if you're a leader, trying to roll out a big corporate change, or maybe you're a founder pitching a really revolutionary product, or, is it just trying to get a new policy adopted in your community? We always inevitably run headfirst into that wall, the wall of resistance.
And what's our first instinct? It's that almost reflexive response when we feel that pushback.
We push harder.
We push harder. Exactly. We instinctively think that, well, the failure must be in the weakness of our argument. So we load up on more facts, right? We prepare a more aggressive presentation. We just increase the pressure.
Turn up the volume.
Yeah, turn up the volume, deliver a more intense message. We think, look, if I just show them the irrefutable data one more time, they simply have to agree with me.
Which, as all the sources we've looked at show, across business, psychology, you name it, that is precisely the wrong instinct. It's actually counterproductive.
And that reversal, that complete flip of the script, is the entire mission of this deep dive. We are exploring the framework from Jonah Berger's really powerful analysis, the catalyst, how to change anyone's mind. And the main idea here, the thesis, is genuinely surprising.
It is. It's not just surprising, it's very counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Especially for people in leadership roles who are, kind of used to issuing mandates and just having things happen.
Right.
Berger's core argument is that pushing harder doesn't just fail to persuade people, it often actively creates the resistance. It solidifies the other person's viewpoint because when you apply force, they naturally put up their defenses and pull back.
So we have to come at this from a totally different mindset. The fundamental shift, and this is really the key, is that influence isn't about adding pressure. It's about finding and removing friction. Lasting change, whether that's a shift in corporate strategy, a personal habit, whatever, it only happens when those invisible barriers that are stopping people are, quietly and methodically removed. It makes the change feel like their own idea.
I think that shift in framing is maybe the most powerful thing we can take away, even before we get into the practical steps. What's so fascinating is how Berger reframes resistance itself. The research suggests people aren't, inherently stubborn or malicious, which is often our first assumption when someone disagrees with us.
Oh yeah, they just don't get it.
Exactly. Instead, he says they are simply, and I just love this definition, anchored by friction. They're stuck. They're stuck because there are these invisible psychological barriers that are preventing them from moving forward. And our job is to be the lubricant, not the bulldozer.
Wow. That completely reframes the entire problem of influence, doesn't it? It moves the diagnosis from, oh, they're being irrational or they're being difficult, to, okay, I haven't successfully cleared the path for them to move. The responsibility shifts entirely to the person trying to make the change.
Precisely. And this isn't just, some feel-good management theory. The sources are really clear that Berger is drawing on robust research, psychology, behavioral science, decades of marketing data. And he brings in these fascinating real-world case studies. You see it in high-stakes business negotiations, in political campaigns, in social change movements. This approach is really grounded in what actually makes us humans tick.
And to help us navigate these 5 distinct types of psychological friction, he gives us a really practical, memorable tool, a diagnostic tool, really.
Yes. And that's what we're going to be diving deep into, this powerful framework from the source material called REDTE, it's an acronym, and it outlines the 5 main psychological barriers to change, REDUCE. And crucially, it gives us the specific solution for overcoming each one. The whole idea is you first have to diagnose the friction. Only then can you apply the right solution. It's targeted, not just, a scattergun blast of data.
All right, so before we jump into the REDCE framework itself, we need to spend a little time here in section 1, really internalizing the philosophy behind it all. This is like the core operating system of the catalyst.
And core lesson number 1, which is stated so clearly in the research, is this: people don't hate change. They hate being changed. And that is such a subtle but truly monumental distinction. It's what separates the effective catalysts from the frustrating persuaders.
It really is. I mean, think about it. When we propose a change, a big reorganization at work, a new technology, even just a new family budget, and we hit that wall of resistance, we often assume the person just fundamentally disagrees with the idea itself, with the substance of it. But what the research is saying is that the resistance usually isn't about the merit of the idea. It's rooted in a feeling of losing control. It's all about autonomy.
Right. If we feel that a decision, even one we might intellectually agree is good for us, is being imposed on us, that we're being told what to do, we feel this psychological squeeze. And that feeling of being mandated, it immediately triggers this fight back reaction. It's called reactance. We push back just to reclaim our own sense of agency. You might actually agree with the change, but the fact that you're being forced into it becomes the real problem.
I think that's the hardest thing for leaders to accept, isn't it? Because part of their job is to mandate things. But what the sources are suggesting is that the delivery mechanism is maybe more important than the content of the mandate itself. So the key isn't to make your argument stronger, it's to dissolve that feeling of coercion and give back that sense of agency.
That's the paradigm shift. The focus has to be entirely on removing the barriers, not on adding more layers of persuasion or data. Pressure just reinforces the idea that we're trying to control them.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, then the catalyst isn't really about controlling people at all. It's about understanding human psychology so well that you can just bypass that defensive instinct.
Absolutely. The final verdict from analyzing the source material is really clear. True persuasion happens when you stop pushing and you start enabling. You move from being a source of pressure to being a source of empowerment.
And I find the application of this for the listener, to be so ethical and important. This approach isn't manipulative. It's not about exploiting cognitive biases to trick people. It's smart, it's practical, and frankly, it's respectful because it's all about giving agency back to the other person. And if you're a leader or a parent, you want a method that works for the long haul.
Exactly. When you enable someone to change on their own terms, that change sticks.
Yeah.
It has to, because it's internally motivated. You've moved from being an opponent in a debate where someone has to lose to being a partner on a journey where both of you can win.
Yeah.
You're helping them become their own catalyst.
That is the foundation we need. Okay, now let's get into the practical tools. Let's get into the framework. This is the heart of our deep dive. Section 2, the RDCCE framework itself. We're going to take each letter one by one. We'll really spend time defining the psychological barrier and then analyze the specific practical solution that Berger suggests. Let's start with R.
So R stands for reactance. We've touched on this, but it's often called the fight back instinct. It's that instantaneous barrier that goes up when people feel pressured or controlled or just told what to do. It's an immediate, almost visceral response to a perceived threat to your freedom.
We see this everywhere, right? But it's so obvious in situations where there's a power dynamic. Like, you might have the objectively perfect business strategy backed by 1,000 hours of research, but if your delivery basically signals this is non-negotiable and your input doesn't matter, that reactance barrier just shoots right up. People will push back even if they know the change is good for them, just because that feeling of losing control triggers resistance.
And that's the nuance that gets missed so often. It's not about the facts, it's about the feeling. And the involuntary reaction is to assert your freedom. So the solution, which is so wonderfully counterintuitive, is to intentionally give autonomy. Instead of making demands, the influencer has to deliberately give people choice, or at least the feeling of choice.
Okay, wait, I have to push back a little on that. If I need a very specific outcome, like a new safety protocol has to be followed, no exceptions. Giving complete autonomy seems, incredibly risky. How does a leader ensure compliance if they're giving up control?
That is a crucial question. And the sources address it by showing the difference between actual control and perceived control. The practical strategy is layered. First, as we mentioned, ask questions instead of making demands. A demand imposes. A question explores. It brings the other person into the process with you.
Let's get into the weeds on that technique because I think it's so powerful.
Okay, so instead of the coercive statement, we must cut our budget by 15% immediately, which just screams reactance, you could open with a series of questions. You're using something called choice architecture. So you might say, okay, team, we need to find a 15% efficiency gain this quarter. Our options are A, a targeted hiring freeze, B, reducing our travel and vendor spending, or C, consolidating our software platforms. Which two of these do you think would cause the least disruption to our workflow?
Okay. That is a fundamental difference. You've kept the necessary constraint, the 15% goal is still there, but you've given them ownership over how they get there. They're no longer fighting the mandate. They're solving a problem you invited them to help with.
Exactly. You've used choice architecture, which the sources point to as a critical tool for getting past reactance. You've framed the conversation so that they persuade themselves. They're talking through the options, picking the least painful path. And in doing so, they start to own the idea of the change instead of just rejecting your influence.
It turns the leader from an oppressor into a facilitator. It changes the whole energy of the room.
And there's the even deeper psychological piece here. A lot of the time when people resist, they just want to feel heard. They want their perspective to be acknowledged. So when you ask, what are your concerns about this? Or what challenges do you see coming? You're legitimizing their viewpoint. By inviting that input, you move from a top-down mandate to a collaborative problem-solving session. And that dramatically reduces the friction from reactants.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the E in Urdu-Dusi, we hit endowment. So if reactance is about control, this barrier is. It feels purely psychological. It's our weirdly profound love for what we already have.
The endowment effect, yeah. It's a cornerstone of behavioral economics. And understanding its real weight is just. It's vital. It describes this deeply ingrained kind of irrational tendency we have to value what we already possess way more than what we might gain.
And the research on this is just staggering, right? I mean, Daniel Kahneman and others found that the psychological pain of a loss is roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. That's a 2-to-1 ratio against you.
Precisely. You are not fighting an equal battle. So what this means is, if you're a leader proposing a change, you're not just fighting apathy. You're fighting this inflated, powerful psychological stickiness to how things are right now. The old system, even if it's full of flaws, is known, it's owned, it's endowed. The new system is just its abstract potential, and it has to deliver twice the perceived value just to break even in their minds.
I see this all the time in sales. A salesperson will focus entirely on the new features, the bells and whistles of their new product. But they almost never acknowledge the huge psychological friction of replacing the old familiar system that the client has already invested so much time and money and training into.
The perceived loss of the status quo outweighs the perceived gain of the future state almost every single time. So how do we get past this powerful anchor? The solution detailed in the sources is to highlight loss.
Wait, okay, I feel like I need to challenge this one too. Isn't focusing on loss? Isn't that a little manipulative? Or maybe even fear-mongering? Where do the sources draw the line between an ethical reframe and just applying emotional pressure?
That's a really important distinction, and the research is clear. The difference is whether the loss is real and measurable versus some fabricated fear. We are not manufacturing imaginary threats. We're simply reframing the conversation away from the abstract risk of changing to the very concrete cost of not changing, the cost of inaction.
So you stop selling the gains of the future, and you start selling the pain of the present.
Exactly. So instead of saying, if you adopt our new data system, you'll save 5 hours of reporting time every week, which is a soft future gain. You reframe it to highlight the loss that's already happening. You say, by sticking with your current system, you are hemorrhaging 5 hours of high-value strategic time every single week. That translates to a measurable loss of, say, $10,000 a year in unrealized opportunity.
Wow. Okay, that is a massive difference. You're using that powerful psychological pain of loss to motivate action right now. The decision changes from, should I take a risk to maybe gain X, to, wow, am I willing to keep accepting this known measurable loss of Y?
It creates a real sense of urgency. And you can apply this to personal change too. If you want someone to start exercising, don't just talk about the abstract gain of better fitness, but talk about the immediate loss of energy they feel every afternoon, the loss of potential quality time with their kids because they're tired, or the measurable loss of health metrics that are already going in the wrong direction. You use our natural tendency to avoid loss as the fuel for change.
That brings us powerfully to de-distance.
Right, so distance is the third barrier. This happens when the gap between where a person is now and the desired future state just feels overwhelming. It feels too vast, too complex. If the goal is too big or the effort required seems immense, people just get hit with inertia. They won't even start the journey. Even if they agree with the final destination, they're just paralyzed by the scope of it all.
This is the classic, I want to write a novel, but I haven't written a single word. Paralysis. The goal itself is so distant, and there are so many steps outlining drafting, editing, pitching, that taking the first step feels totally insignificant. Like, why bother starting a 1,000-mile journey with just one step?
Right. And the cognitive science tells us that the size of that first required step is often the single biggest predictor of whether someone will start or not. The feeling of being overwhelmed just triggers avoidance. So the solution is actually pretty straightforward, but it does require discipline. Break down the steps.
You have to make the journey feel navigable. You do that by chopping it up into these small, manageable, bite-sized stages. You're shifting their mental focus away from the intimidating summit of the mountain and onto the next tiny, achievable step on the trail right in front of them.
And the sources specifically emphasize this phrase, small steps beat big persuasion. We often think that a grand, loud, inspiring argument will create a grand, massive change. But usually, the size of the argument just increases the perceived distance. It makes the goal feel even more unreachable.
So what makes a small step successful in this framework? Is it just a tiny piece of the overall plan?
It has to be an optimal first step that feels almost trivial. According to studies on commitment and consistency, that first step should be so easy that it requires almost zero effort. It should feel ridiculously safe. So for example, in a big corporate change, don't ask the resistant department to adopt the new software platform fully next month. Ask them to spend 10 minutes filling out a survey on their current pain points, or just agree to a 5-minute demo of the new system's login screen.
The goal is just to overcome inertia. Once there's movement, even a tiny bit of momentum can start to build. But if that initial force required to get started is too high, the whole process just stalls out.
Inertia is overcome by reducing the force required to start. It's like marathon training. The first step shouldn't be run 3 miles tomorrow. It should be put on your running shoes and put them by the door tonight. That trivial commitment removes the psychological barrier of preparation, and it makes the next step, just walking out the door, so much easier.
That structural thinking is incredibly useful. Okay, let's move to uncertainty.
Right. Uncertainty revolves around the inherent risk and the ambiguity of any change. People avoid change not just because it's hard work, that's distance, or because they love the status quo, that's endowment, but because the outcomes just feel unclear. They feel uncertain or potentially really risky.
All those questions pop into your head. Will I fail? Will I look foolish in front of my team? Is this new system going to cost more than they promised? Will this new habit actually work for me?
Exactly. And that fear of the unknown outcome holds people back far more effectively than any rational argument can push them forward. When you're faced with an uncertain benefit versus a certain known status quo, the status quo almost always wins. Even if it's terrible, we choose the devil we know over the potential angel we don't.
Which means our job as the catalyst is to lower that perceived risk. We have to make it feel safe.
And to counter uncertainty, the solution is multifaceted. Reduce ambiguity. And you do this by providing clear, concrete evidence, by offering specific, detailed examples you have to show, not just tell, and by providing tangible reassurance to minimize that risk.
You know, I think the power of a specific example can't be overstated here. Abstract data points might convince our rational brain, but when you see a successful pilot program in action, or you hear a story from a colleague about exactly how the new process works for them, it makes it real. It reduces the ambiguity. You can actually visualize yourself succeeding.
Absolutely. The research highlights that showing the mechanism, showing detailed success stories, providing clear forecasts, all of that reduces the perceived risk. One really effective tactic the sources mention is creating safe failure zones.
A safe failure zone? What does that look like in practice?
It's basically a pilot program where failure has zero negative consequence. So, for example, if an organization is hesitant to adopt some new collaborative software, they might try it with one small, low-stakes internal project first. The team knows that if it goes sideways, they can easily just go back to the old method. No one's career is on the line. And that drastically lowers the emotional barrier to just trying it.
And I imagine reassurance is a huge part of this as well.
Oh, it's vital. It means standing behind the change with genuine accountability. It could be a strong, time-bound guarantee for a product, or a promise of 24/7 tech support for a new system. Or it could just be the influencer saying clearly to their team, listen, if this goes wrong, I will take full responsibility. Your job is just to try it. When you reduce uncertainty, you're making the change feel safe. And making it feel safe is what makes it startable.
And finally, that brings us to CE, which stands for corroborating evidence.
Yes, this last barrier addresses our deep human need for validation, for proof. Relying on a single piece of evidence, even a really powerful one, or a single trusted source, it's usually not enough to fundamentally change a deep belief or a long-held behavior. We are naturally skeptical of outliers or one-off success stories.
We've all done this, right? We use that defense mechanism. Oh, that's great, it worked for them, but my situation is totally unique. We build these mental defenses against single points of data because it's just easier to dismiss one data point than it is to change our entire mental model of the world.
So the solution requires consistency and trust. The evidence has to be provided through what Berger calls multiple signals. The person trying to make the change has to show that the proof is, one, repeated consistently over time, and two, that it's coming from multiple, independent, and trusted sources. It's about building irrefutability.
So it's not enough for the CEO to just issue a mandate based on their gut feeling, which is a reactance warning right there, or even based on a single expert report, which is an uncertainty warning. It needs to be a chorus of validation.
It's a chorus, exactly.
Yeah.
Think about a marketing team trying to convince leadership to invest in a brand new, expensive platform. They can't just rely on the vendor's case study. They need to provide multiple signals. So you'd have A, social proof, like testimonials from 5 peer companies who have succeeded. B, expert validation, like a recent third-party industry report confirming this tech is necessary.
Yeah.
And C, internal testing repeated, consistent data from a small pilot showing measurable gains.
That's the difference between a single point of light and a floodlight. And the sources stress that consistency is often more important than intensity. A huge barrage of pressure from one source can still be dismissed as just bias. But a steady trickle of consistent, varied proof from different independent places that builds up the accumulated proof you need to get past skepticism and really anchor that new belief.
You're essentially closing off all the mental escape routes that skepticism gives us. By the time that person receives the 6th piece of corroborating evidence from 6 different directions, they realize they're no longer fighting your opinion. They're fighting an overwhelming, verified reality. And that's when the resistance finally starts to dissipate.
The power of that framework is just. It's immense. It moves influence away from abstract communication theory and into a systematic diagnostic tool. Okay, we have successfully navigated the entire Ari-Dudici framework: reactance, endowment, distance, uncertainty, and corroborating evidence. Let's take a step back now in section 3 and synthesize all of this. Let's focus on how this really changes our fundamental approach to leadership and communication.
Yeah, let's quickly summarize the main takeaways. The fundamental lesson here is that influence is solely about barrier removal. We should really see ourselves as architects of smooth paths, not as battering rams trying to break down walls.
And within that, the execution has to prioritize humility and asking questions over arguing and using force. We learn that questions, when they're used strategically, are just exponentially more powerful than forceful arguments. They engage the other person's agency. They reduce reactance instantly.
And tying all 5 of those points together is the ultimate goal. Sustainable change can only come from the inside. When people choose to change, when they feel they have autonomy, when the losses of inaction are clear, when the steps are small, when the risk is low, and when the evidence is irrefutable, that change actually lasts. It lasts because they own it. They became their own catalyst.
The analogy is so strong, and I think it's why this framework gets such high marks from people who use it. True influence is achieved when you step back and you help people persuade themselves. You're not trying to win a debate. When you're focused on removing their friction, you're aligning your goals with their deep psychological needs for safety and for autonomy.
Which brings us to the real-world validation. Analyzing the reviews and the feedback from people who've actually implemented the catalyst shows these overwhelmingly positive results. Because it's not theoretical. It works in messy, high-stakes, real-world situations.
So what specifically was it that resonated with leaders and managers who put this into practice?
The feedback consistently highlighted a few key things. First, just that eye-opening shift itself, moving their focus from traditional persuasion tactics, which usually just means more intensity, to friction removal. They loved shifting from asking, how do I talk better, to asking, how do I clear the path better? Second, the clear, practical structure of RE-DCC makes it instantly diagnostic. If your client is dragging their feet, you can quickly analyze, is this endowment? Is this uncertainty? And then you apply the specific solution.
And the utility of this isn't just for the boardroom, right? It seems truly universal.
Oh, absolutely not. The feedback we saw emphasized its utility across so many contexts. It works for B2B sales, for large-scale leadership communication, for change management, and surprisingly, it showed strong results in really personal areas like parenting, coaching, even in relationships. It just works wherever human resistance is present.
Can you share some of the specific impacts people reported? Like, how did using RE-DCC actually change their professional behavior?
One consistent change was in how they approached team leadership. Leaders reported they stopped issuing unilateral mandates and started offering shared, pre-vetted options. That's R for reactance mastery right there. They also changed how they sell ideas. They started focusing heavily on the tangible, documented cost of delay, the current productivity loss, rather than just talking about future benefits. That's E for endowment in action.
And crucially, the sources note that this really improved how they approach resistant people because they can achieve influence without having to resort to manipulation.
Exactly. And that last point is maybe the most important ethical outcome. The method is powerful because it respects the autonomy of the other person. It seeks internal motivation, not forced compliance.
That's an incredibly comprehensive validation. But to maintain a balanced perspective, we should always address the nuance. Were there any common criticisms or places where readers felt the material fell a little short?
Yeah, there are a couple of fair points that came up in the analysis. For one, if you're already deeply familiar with Berger's earlier work, especially his book Contagious, you might find some of the underlying research or examples a bit familiar. This book is, in a way, a consolidation and a highly structured refinement of those concepts, applied specifically to overcoming resistance.
So it's not necessarily brand new foundational science, but it's a brilliant new framework for applying existing science.
Precisely. And furthermore, the sources make it clear that this is a highly logical structural approach. So if you came to the book expecting, quick persuasion tricks or techniques focused on emotional manipulation or charisma, you might find this approach a bit too subtle, maybe too systematic.
Because it's focused on the long game of removing barriers, not a quick hack for exploiting emotional triggers.
That's right. It requires patience. It requires diagnostics. It prioritizes sustainable internal change over immediate forced compliance. But the overwhelming verdict really reinforces the power of the framework. The Catalyst provides a smart, practical, and respectful approach to influence that's ideal for any leader who understands that lasting success requires genuine buy-in.
What a deep dive. We started with this paradox of pushing harder, and we ended with a 5-part, actionable framework for quietly removing the roadblocks. I think the core mantra is one we should all carry with us. If you want to change minds, behaviors, or habits, don't push harder. Find and remove what's holding people back.
And that leads to the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, which connects the cost of friction right back to that key lesson of reactance. Just think for a moment about the amount of time, the energy, the relational capital you are currently burning every single week, fighting friction that you yourself unknowingly created.
That feeling of wanting immediate control, that impulse to just issue a demand or to force compliance, that might do the single biggest piece of friction you are adding to your own efforts. And it ensures their long-term failure, forcing you to fight the same battles over and over again.
So sustainable change really does require internal choice. Then maybe your greatest challenge this week is to identify one piece of friction you are personally responsible for adding. Is it too much pressure, creating reactance? Is it too much focus on gains, hitting the endowment wall? Is your ask just too big, creating distance?
Identify that friction, apply the RD2CE framework to remove it, and then just watch how quickly the walls of resistance can naturally start to come down. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.